Hello, my name is Robin, and today I will be talking about image placeholders for web pages. This is important because for most web pages, images make up about 50% of their total file size. Even though networks have gotten faster in later years, our screens also have gotten larger, which means that images also have gotten larger, and so web pages take longer to load. This is why several larger websites have started to use the technique of placeholders, where instead of loading the big image up front, you first show a very simple placeholder. For example, Google Images just uses a single solid color for each image, and then when the final image is indeed loaded, they replace this with the full quality version. There are many ways of doing this. You could also have a very rough, low resolution version of the image, or of course the all-known progressive JPEG, which sends a small, low quality version of the image at first and then increases the quality as new layers are coming in. Although these techniques work, it's arguable that it's not always very clear what such a placeholder represents. I can assume that a lot of viewers would not know what this image is supposed to become after the full version is downloaded. Maybe it becomes a little bit more easy if we share the rasterized version, although a lot of people will still have trouble recognizing that this is indeed the Mona Lisa. Now you can also see there's a difference between the second and third image. This is because the second image is a rasterized low-resolution version of the original, but the third image is actually a blurred version of a vectorized version of the original. Now, the difference between the two is that rasterized lower resolution still shows some visual artifacts, while the vector, as you might remember, is a more mathematical description of the image of various geometric shapes, and so it can scale to about any size that you might want to. So this is ideal for our large screen resolution use case. Now you might also wonder, how then will we go from the original raster image to the vector image, because obviously we don't want to create all these things manually. So we used two different methods. There are many ways of doing this. We will discuss mostly the two that we have been used in our implementation. But the first one uses a genetic algorithm, which first generates a lot of different random shapes. That's the first image that you see. It then chooses the best shape out of those, which it will then use for a simple hill climbing method to find the best fit in that local maximum to finally get a result. And so you see it's a very iterative algorithm. It uses more and more shapes as it goes on, until a certain threshold of, in this case, amount of shapes or maybe perceived quality has been reached. Doing this, we can of course tweak the amount of shapes, where you can see that 500 shapes actually already leads to a very agreeable result. However, we can also see, if we zoom in, for example, on the face, that it is not an immediate perfect result and that it doesn't really represent the original image in terms of quality. There's a second method we can use, which uses a very different approach. As you can see on the right side here, it is using what is called a decision tree to subdivide the image into ever smaller areas, generating the same illusion that we had before, but in a very different way. This is using clever machine learning techniques to get to this result. And you can subdivide more and more and more to get more quality. As you can see here, on the left you have the low quality and high quality versions. The interesting observation is that the high quality version here is actually a lot better subjectively than the high quality version of the previous one, although they are of similar file size. This is mainly because the second method does not use as much overlapping individual shapes as the right one, and so it saves on a bit of file size. However, there is still a problem with both of these methods in terms of file size. It is that 40 kilobytes is already quite good, especially better than full 4K image, but we can go and we want to go even lower. And the main way we want to do that, and this is where I get into our main contributions for this area, is how we think that we might skip, for example, some of the background details and focus the details where they are needed. For example, we might argue that this is a more agreeable image, or at least this one is a bit of an extreme version, but this one is a more agreeable and interesting image than the original high quality version that we had generated. Even though they are using, they take up about the same amount of file size, and the more detailed versions are actually slightly smaller. Now how do we do this? We do this by incorporating saliency information. into the algorithm. So saliency is a term that means where is the user most likely to look at in the image? Which parts of the image will the user most likely find interesting? In this case, of course, the face of the Mona Lisa. A different example here in this image, obviously the ship will probably be the most important aspect of the image. Now, how do we get this salient information? We might use existing datasets that include saliency information. For example, open images and label me are the ones that we have been using. For images that we do not have saliency information for, we are using an open source implementation of CellNet, which, as you can see, generates these nice heat maps. We then post-process these using a simple Python script into bounding boxes for salient regions. Adapting the original algorithm like this gives us these kinds of results. So on the left we see the original version, on the right we see the saliency driven, and you can see it automatically goes for the very important region of the face. When compared to the full random, which also adds a lot of details into the background, which is less important in this image. Now, of course, the right one is very, very strict. As you can see on the top, we have 100% bias towards only using the salient regions. We can balance this out a bit more and make sure that the background also gets a little bit of detail, of course. And so we can show a couple of examples. For example, here, the salient version puts a little bit more emphasis on the Volkswagen bus. This is a good example, but it's not fantastic. The technique really only shines if you have a single, very salient part of the image. So, for example, if you have human faces. So this is zoomed in on the salient human face in the bigger picture. You can see that the difference is quite shocking. The second example, also of a face, you can again see the difference is less impressive than the previous one, still pretty good. And these are all images for 500 shapes, as we showed before. But the difference is even worse, or even better, I should say, if we go to a lower amount of shapes, where on the right you have a much clearer indication of what the person actually looks like with these low amounts of shapes. Another good example is here. Even though we cannot see the text Barcelona even in the saliency information, the letter 3 is much more clearly visible. Again, not very impressive in the 500 shape scenario, but in the 300 shape scenario, in the 100 shape scenario, it's actually arguable that the left image is not even a very good placeholder at all. The next one is actually my favorite image of the tested set, because on the random version we still see a lot of detail in, for example, the left trouser of Abraham Lincoln there, while on the right side we shift that detail and the focus towards the face and the two hands. This leads us to a couple of less good examples that we have found where we have mistakes made in the algorithm. For example, here, the Tower of Pisa, you can see that the saliency version has a lot less detail towards the bottom of the tower, so you could say that the random version is actually the better one of the two. And the problem here is that the CellNet implementation only identified the top of the tower as actually the main important part of the region instead of the whole tower as a whole. There's another problem if you have images that don't have a very clear salient region. For example, here everything is almost as important, and so it doesn't really make a large difference. This is similar to if you have a more abstract or artistic setup. Here the salient region is the airplane, and we do have more detail there, but it could be argued that the quality loss in the sun is worse and is to be prevented, and so the random version on the left is actually the one that users would like to view more. A similar thing happens if you have iconic images, in this case the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, where you don't really need more information into the towers themselves because the image is so iconic people recognize it even in the fully random version. Similarly, this happens with the red Mini in this image. Mini is such a recognizable car brand that people know what these look like even without the additional saliency. I think this is really driven home again in a 100 shape version of the same image, where you can see that the left side already probably is enough for people to get the idea that there is a Mini in this image as well. So the saliency information doesn't really contribute all that much. So summary of these observations: if there's a really clear single salient region, for example for a shape, it really helps, and it also helps for if you have a low number of shapes. So it's definitely interesting to keep the file size down. However, there are also situations in which the saliency version is actually less attractive or less applicable than the fully random version. This means that we need some more ongoing work. For example, we are now using method 2 to try and combine this with method 1 to make sure that we have better details where we need them. There is a very similar paper that's been published, but it's using a very different use case. It's using this more for artistic generations, and they have not open sourced their dataset, so it's very difficult for us to compare results, but at least the technical approach that we are taking is very different. We are also looking into doing a more high-level classifications. So for example, looking if the image has a lot of detail, if the image contains faces, for example, to then drive our parameters in one way or the other. You can also maybe envision using some manual intervention from users themselves. We could also do this more objectively. Let's say we have a maximum file size or a screen size in mind that we should keep, and we can tweak the parameters based on that. There's other things that are still unclear. It's what the overhead of the SVG approach brings. Raster images are typically quite fast, both in terms of compression and render speed. SVGs, it's a lot less clear how well this will hold up, especially on very large screens or on very low-powered devices, so we still need to look into that. But the real thing that is also very unclear, and this is the main reason actually that we started doing this research, where we want to go to, is that it's very unclear what users actually think of this method of using placeholders. As I said, there are plenty of high-profile websites like Google, like Facebook, using these techniques, so they must have some positive impact on their metrics, but it's unclear which of these users prefer and why, and if they would actually prefer the more high-quality SVGs over the others. So that's something that we can research. There's, however, a second aspect that is even more important, I think, and that is currently we are approaching this from we have a placeholder and we are always going to replace it with the full quality version as soon as possible. The real question that I want to ask is that always needed? Do we always need to upgrade to the full quality version? Is that always worth the cost? Let's think of situations where, for example, again, you have several images being downloaded at the same time. You might have some images that are more important. You might only want to load those images in a full quality as soon as possible. Or you might be on a very slow network. You might not want to wait for these images to be downloaded, especially if they do not contribute really to the content of the website. I've included here a screenshot of the Medium website. They always have these very randomly loosely connected images to the content of the article. You might say users might not want to pay for the data that is needed to download this image because it doesn't really contribute all that much to the content, especially if they are on a very high cost network. So the real question I want to ask as well is to say, why don't we give users control? Why don't we let the users say, I think the placeholder was enough. I don't really need the full version of the image. And if they do need, they can choose the quality in which to download. If you have a very small file size, you might overlay it with, for example, a machine learning generated label for the image. Or if you have a high quality, that might not even be needed, as you can see here in the third case. So that's where we want to go to. We have two prongs of our research: an objective component, a technical component, which is almost ready for evaluation. That's where we're currently at. And then when we have these nice data sets, placeholder techniques for various different images and websites, we will try to do some subjective evaluations with real users, seeing if they like the placeholder technique, yes or no. If they do, which of the placeholder techniques they like the most. And if they like the high quality SVGs, do they always want them to upgrade to the full version of the image or not, and in which cases. So please, you can follow our progress on these on the listed website, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me at the listed email address. Thank you.